Welcome to Psychoanalytic Perspectives on Racism in America. This series explores the enduring presence of racism and the psychoanalytic mechanisms that sustain it, drawing inspiration from key works and current research. Hosts Dr. Karyne Messina and Dr. Felecia Powell-Williams explore the complexities of racism through the lens of psychoanalysis as they foster a crucial dialogue on racial inequality. Here are your hosts.
Welcome to Psychoanalytic Perspectives on Racism in America. This is a special series on the New Books Network. I'm Dr. Karyne Messina. Joining me is my co-host, Felecia Powell-Williams. Today, we're going to talk about, and this is what we talk about always on this particular podcast, Psychoanalytic Perspectives on Racism in America. And we're going to talk about how the tools and concepts of psychoanalysis can help us understand the persistence and the dynamics of racism in the United States. And we'll be talking, not today, but over time in our episodes, we'll be talking with psychoanalysts, and particularly Black psychoanalysts who have a particularly unique insight about this. And we're going to be asking them to help us comprehend and think about together with us how we can combat racism. A lot of this has to do with mechanisms of defense. So about that too. Okay, Felecia, let's summarize the story for our listeners before we talk about James Baldwin's brilliant use of defense mechanisms, the way he incorporated it into a story. You'd think he had been a psychoanalyst himself for many, many years. So why don't we get started talking about going to meet the man?
Karyne, that sounds really good, and I agree with you. You would wonder if he was an analyst. So can we just kind of expand this a little bit more and think about going to meet the man, the narrative, the content? I think it's a remarkable piece of Baldwin's work. So as we begin to expand this, why don't you tell us a little bit more of how you're thinking about it and summarize it yourself?
Well, I think one of the main things, and I'm repeating myself, but this is so important in this story, is that how he incorporates almost every defense mechanism I can think of. And my favorite one is projective identification, because I think it's ubiquitous, and I think it happens in so many situations, which I've written in politics, with domestic violence, in racism, discrimination of all types. People can't tolerate things within themselves, feelings, thoughts, and what do? They put it on somebody else, and they say, this is one of the titles of one of my books, it's not me, it's you. So that
famous line
is woven in to the threads of this book. And particularly the way he weaves together memories that Jesse, the main character, has in this book, memories with present experiences, exposing deep-rooted psychological, the impact of racism of both the oppressor and the oppressed. So the story culminates with Jesse, who's aroused by violent memories, aggressively initiates sex with Grace while using racist language. Well, this, of course, underscores disturbing connections between racial hatred and sexuality in his mind. Now, this is, mind you, a short story. Not a lot in the short story. And through this unflinching exploration of Jesse's psyche, Baldwin offers a searing critique of systematic racism embedded in American society and the corrosive effects it has on on human relationships, and on individual psychology, the individual psychology of people, many, many people.
Uh-huh.
So why don't we talk a little bit about the conflicts of the story, Felecia?
That sounds good, Karyne. When looking at conflicts, I think much about what Baldwin writes here, and I have my notes here because I don't want to miss a beat because this is such, again, beautiful and rich work from Baldwin. But where I go is how the book opens up, and it opens up in this present day, and it alternates between present day struggles and looking at the impotence of his memories and the impotence of his memories of several racial violence scenes that come up. And I think that is really powerful in how he weaves that into the story. But then Baldwin continues on in how he thinks about Jesse, how he writes about this 42-year-old, white police officer, and how he's really struggling, to sexually perform with his wife, Grace. And it leads to him, reflecting on these recent events that he's really grappling with, including just the brutal treatment of civil rights protesters. Baldwin goes there, but then later, as Jesse continues with the struggle, some of the current situations that Baldwin brings into the narrative really delves into the past, and it's revealing this very pivotal childhood experience of Jesse's, where he witnesses this horrific lynching. And this event, which one would imagine is a really formative moment in Jesse's life, and especially the way that Baldwin writes it, because he writes it as if we are, walking with Jesse up to that point of the lynching, and we're feeling, at least I began to feel just the shoulders bumping up against each other, the physical heat, the way in which Baldwin writes about the excitement and how people were preparing for this as if it was, a major family event. And then also, linking the violence against Black people with sexual arousal, and then a sense of white supremacy. So this is really, a very powerful portrayal that Baldwin brings to us. Now, what I do wonder though, Karyne, how do you think about Jesse's perspective as a white police officer and how that contributed to the story's impact, though?
Well, I'm struck again by the defense mechanisms. I think that Jesse probably, well, he would have had to have been traumatized as a child to watch a lynching. And yet this comes out in many aggressive ways when he's a man and a police officer down the road many years. But I think this is to some extent, or to a large extent, repressed, another defense mechanism. And I think it resurfaces. So he represses it, and then unconsciously, of course, and then it comes back, I think, during moments of impotence. And this indicates that I do think that the events were traumatic and had a lasting psychological effect on him. But of course, he's not aware of any of this. He's not aware of the trauma other than in an unconscious way. So I think that he also projects his own sexual insecurities and moral failings onto Black people, as you suggested a few minutes ago, viewing them as hypersexual and dangerous. So there you go. There's projection. Black people are the dangerous ones. but yet he's the one who's so brutal with, say, the civil rights, the people who are marching. He's the one that, I mean, brutality is the name of the game with him. But this whole thing allows him to avoid confronting it, this defense mechanism. So that's one thing that I have to say. And I also think his impotence, as you suggested, represents a fundamental weakness of white supremacy. He needs this racist violence to regain his potency.
That's right.
Suggests that the white supremacy system requires constant reinforcement to sustain itself. And I was thinking of, this is not a defense mechanism I don't think people think about too much, but symbolism. And defense where an individual uses an object, an act, or a symbol to represent an internal conflict. And I think Jesse does that throughout the book.
And just listening to how you're thinking about this, it does bring in this other thought for me of Jesse needing to stay connected. It's so important for him to feel as if he belongs to something. Where do we go with projective identification? There is some sense of connection there. You know, we're connected to something that we really want to defend against and project and get rid of, but then hopefully for someone else to be able to connect with what's being projected. You know, so there's such, wonderful ways in which to think about this. But, you bring in the big T word, and that is trauma. Yeah.
What you just said reminded me of how we all need connection. We know that. We need to be connected to a community. But if we can't, we can be in an unhealthy way connected to the recipient of our projections. And that's what happens with projective identification. The person starts to feel, the recipient starts to feel, hey, maybe I really am that way.
That's right. That's right.
It seems to come through in this wonderful short story. Many of this works. There's a connection, but it's certainly not a healthy connection.
That's right. I started to think about something as you were sharing, and I started to think about, in this story, the link between racism and sexuality. I started to drift off to that place, and I was wondering about something, because the story does, tend to intertwine with the racism and the sexuality, often through Jesse's sexual dysfunction, which is cured through the racial violence. So there's something about this, when you mention brutality, I think about the aggression. And oftentimes the use of aggression, but also the fear of aggression, and how this may have been something that Jesse really grappled with himself. And with this connection that was illustrated in Baldwin's story here, it does lead one to think about displacement.
Absolutely.
So as we look at defense mechanisms, I then think about displacement, because as we know with displacement, it just involves more of just redirecting emotions, from their original source, if we were to say it in that way, to just a less threatening target. And how that tends to get played out often in this story, just this constant move from this one place to the other to rid oneself of something into a more non-threatening place, or as I said earlier, non-threatening target. So, the brutality, how does it get shifted? And we see in the story that it gets shifted quite often.
Yeah, there's so much about the lynching scene and
Mm-hmm.
back and forth to present day to that memory that's so very important. And there's this cyclical nature of racial violence that goes back from the lynching scene to then what I think that Jesse, in a way, identified with that aggression and then projects it out onto others. So it does reveal a deep-rooted psychological impact on racial violence. Um, so there's the initial innocence. Young Jesse initially views the event with curiosity, not really comprehending the horror. Now that's hard for us to think about. I mean, how could somebody see something like that and not
Mm-hmm.
it was horrible, just absolutely horrific. But in a child's from a child's vantage point, it's hard to know. I mean, I think children would be really frightened, scared, frightened, um, just because of the nature of childhood. But
Mm-hmm.
perhaps Jesse was. Didn't know what to
Well,
make of it.
as I think about it, and we talk about the lynching, we talk about the brutality, Karen. I'm thinking also about how Baldwin really sets this up. It becomes a family event, a family picnic, so to speak. Let's all get ready, to the point of how mother begins to prepare herself for this special moment. The neighbors are coming by, everybody is gathering and getting in the car and they're heading down to this place. And it's a surprise for Jesse. It's going to be something that is the way in which Baldwin presents it. It's really this very grand event that will be eye opening for Jesse to see. And how everyone comes together and they're setting tables and, just having a moment of um, social, um, eh, gosh, I want to call it a party, so to speak. But I mean, it's just so difficult to sit with because here we are, we're getting ready in some levels in the story to celebrate the lynching, to celebrate, to bring everyone together in a way to see this is what happens. Here is the consequence for the other. And we get a chance to celebrate and commune and break bread together and having this privilege and this power to do so and introducing this to one's children and everyone coming together in such this you know very uncivilized event. So it has to be very confusing for the mind of the child because the child is then in that moment identifying with what the parent perhaps is bringing to them, but also identifying with whatever the horrific experience they may be having in what they see of this human being that is being, in a sense, castrated down to this place for merely doing something that perhaps they have the privilege to do. So it has to be somewhat of a confusion, but also just a painful thing to hold on to and try to create in a very different way in one's mind. How might I take this and think of it as a way of being, yeah, as a privilege to have? It has to be confusing for a child.
It has to be, and I think that it probably led to the sexualization of violence in Jesse's life.
Definitely.
did have a lot of confusing feelings of fear, excitement, and arousal. So all of this linked violence to sexuality, and that's why later on in life he has problems with potency and being impotent. It's just
Mhm.
so many confusing feelings, just sort of in a mixing bowl. And
That's right.
there's not any way to understand them. I mean, nobody said there was a psychoanalyst in the picture. So, um, and
But you do. You have the sexuality of the women that Baldwin brings up in the preparation for this. And then you have the men who are presenting themselves as very powerful and very potent and very, in charge. And this is something that they are offering and they're bringing to, as a provider. So it has so much there that underneath and the various layers that Baldwin definitely brings in.
absolutely. As you were speaking earlier, I was thinking about the word party, and while it kind of made me sent chills down my spine, I was thinking
Yes.
how there was parental approval involved. Jesse's father, I think, even lifted him up to see the
Yes, he did.
mutilated body, and how confusing is that for a child? I mean, and speaking of that, it reminds me of intergenerational trauma and how when
That's
things
right.
talk about from one generation to the next, nothing changes. It just gets encapsulated inside the psyche, so to speak. And then it just continues. The racial violence goes on. And I think that's probably what we're seeing in America. It doesn't get talked about and it goes from one generation to the next. So, in some sense, it almost becomes a learned behavior,
That's
but
right.
it's also unconscious to a large extent, unless it's talked about.
Well, and when you say unless it's talked about, and as we see in this story, there's a lynching. But as they gather and they have the meal and the wives and mothers are setting things out, there's still a silence around the lynching. And we've talked about how lynching silences, but there is a silence. There's no talking about it. It's become a part of everyday society within this short story that Baldwin presents to us. It's just a part of, and how it gets used also in a very castrating way with some of the protesters as we look more into what Baldwin brings to us in this story.
Well, this brings me back, as many things do, to projective identification and
Uh-huh.
how the recipient does feel pressured to embody the projected qualities. One example that I often use when I'm explaining this to people, because it is kind of a hard concept to understand. Projection, I think that people understand that pretty well. I have a feeling I don't feel good about it, and so you're the one. But when people start to identify it, there are lots of forms that this takes. So one way I describe it is a man or woman has maybe an evaluation at work with the boss, and the boss says, "Listen, you're just not cutting it. It's not working out here." And the person knows better than to argue with the boss if they want to keep most people know better than to do that if they want to keep their job. So um, they just take it in. The boss may really be angry. He may say, "We're going to put you on a PIP, performance improvement plan."
That's right.
Who likes that? Nobody. So uh, the person goes home and walks in the door, and the stay-at-home person, man or woman, maybe has been taking care of the children or maybe worked for part of the day, pick the kids up from daycare, and is going about their business of the evening, regular family evening. And the person who had a problem with the boss comes in and says, hey, listen, look at this place. This is a mess. I just don't think I'm not going to be able to work my way through this. We might have to end things. This isn't just working out. The kids aren't clean. Dinner's not ready. And the house is a mess. Now, if you have just say 3 children who have been playing, they're not going to be the tidiest little ones around. And if dinner's not ready, well, dinner's not ready. But many people will take that in. I think, oh, that really me? Are the kids really a mess? Oh, the house is messy. Well, yeah, 3 kids running around. That can certainly happen. But if the person takes it in and it starts to seep into their psyche and they start to,
That's right.
then the person has identified with the projection. Now,
That's right.
if the person has done work on himself or herself, they can say, wait a minute, Joe, Jane, Jessica, or Adam, wait just a minute. I think you probably had a bad day. The kids are the way they always are. And yes, the house is tossed up, but 3 children do that. And if
That's right.
well, we can work on that together, as we often do. So you must have a problem. I think maybe you need to own it and do some work on it, whatever it may be, et cetera, et cetera. But that doesn't happen. I would say, my guess is it doesn't happen as often as the person taking it in. So anyway, I think that definitely happened in this story with Jesse.
Oh, definitely.
Projections of this violence, this sexualized violence that is stored in his mind from this traumatic watching this lynching, which makes this just so powerful.
It does. I was also wondering about, as we've talked about projection identification, we've talked about displacement, but I was also wondering about the memories of the lynching and wondered how you were thinking about that too, because that comes up a lot within the story, because I see that as introducing even more defense mechanisms as we start talking about Jesse's memories of the lynching. I think you started to kind of open that door for us to look at that too, Karyne.
Yeah, I think it just permeates every part of this story, and it's a pivotal moment when we learn about that. It affects Jesse. We learn about his memories, but in every single way, he is brutal with people who are marching, who are protesting peacefully with his wife. He's very, very aggressive. I think it's a repressed memory or repressed memories that he's not aware of, and he projects all of this aggression onto others. Pretty much everyone in his life, as far as I could tell. I don't know about friends, but generally speaking.
Well, and it tends to surface in these moments of impotence, when he's feeling powerless. And so I think that's really important too, and how it tends to come back up, and how we look at just the repression, and that it's something that is so deeply buried, it's not a welcome thought, it's an unconscious forgetting or blocking of something that's just unacceptable, an unacceptable thought or feeling. And that's when it seems to come up, in those moments that are really difficult for Jesse. And we see that in the beginning of this story. And, how often this happens. And we see this in the consulting room, that there is something that, is so unconsciously anchored somewhere, and how it is so difficult to hold and to be with. And when it does emerge, what are some of the things that could possibly happen? And then that could lead us back to projective identification, how uncomfortable it is to hold on to that and want to rid oneself of it, but it seems to definitely live there within the story. And, something perhaps even, as we talked about with the lynching, how does he tolerate that? How does he work with that? And does it get buried deep down? Because it's so difficult for him to hold in his conscious mind. And then it comes up in these various ways, and definitely in the impotent moments.
Now, there was one scene, or if you recall it, a jail scene, where I believe it was a Black civil rights leader who was in jail, and Jesse really projects his own, I think, powerlessness and loss of control onto the prisoner, and then tries to provoke. So he projects his powerlessness, and then he tries to, it's almost as if he had a poker. He's trying to provoke the prisoner to react in the ways of these projections. And I think maybe there's even something about a cattle prod, so maybe my image is not really off. Maybe I did remember reading that. But he expects the prisoner to submit and beg for mercy. So there's sadism definitely in this.
Definitely. Yes. Just really, as you were saying, provoking that prisoner to behave a certain way that would be pleasing and that would be, comfortable for Jesse. It kind of, addresses the impotence in some way in which he was feeling powerless and needing to, provoke onto this prisoner a feeling that would make Jesse feel much more seen as not necessarily as the aggressor, which he is, but also, this man that he feels he should become. And I feel as if in that moment, there are these, say, for instance, these ghosts in the nursery that tend to surface. His father is there in the room, perhaps all the other men that were there at that lynching are in the room, and Jesse needing to become that man that, lynches, so to speak, silences, this civil rights protester, and present it in such a way to him and giving him a sense of power.
Well, that's a very powerful statement. And on that note, we could go on, as we often feel. We could talk about this for a couple of hours, but I think maybe for today, this is a good place to stop. And we are doing these podcasts monthly, and we're going to start doing short video clips. We're going to try to do them in the new year, weekly or bi-weekly. So we'll have something for people to follow, a thread for them to follow throughout the month. So thank you, Felecia. It's always
thank you, Karyne.
And happy holidays. And I
happy holidays.
Yes. Talk to you very soon.